work in the theory of truth from the first part of the 20th century by Alfred Tarski, his proposal of what he called a semantic conception of truth. And then on the basis of the Tarskian material, I then distinguished between the distinction that's often made between non-epistemic theories of truth and epistemic theories of truth. Non-epistemic theories of truth make truth something that is quite independent, distinct from justification. The correspondence theory of truth is the obvious and standard non-epistemic theory of truth, but there are so-called deflationary accounts as well, which arguably are also non-epistemic. And I mentioned three different kinds of deflationary conceptions of truth. Non-epistemic conceptions of truth are contrasted with epistemic theories, which make truth a kind of a property that a belief or a theory or a set of beliefs can have in virtue of the epistemic properties of that set of beliefs or belief. For example, being highly justified or being coherent. And one of the famous, well, these are two classic epistemic conceptions of truth. One is the coherence theory, which treats truth as coherence of belief or sentences or propositions, and the other is some form of pragmatism, and pragmatism runs from saying that truth is just that which is useful to believe, all the way up to saying that truth is that which will be accepted in the ideal limit of inquiry. And Putnam, who we're going to look at, Hilary Putnam, has a kind of a Peircean component in his conception of truth. So the plan for today is to talk about Hilary Putnam. Hilary Putnam, I'll start off with what he says about the position that he calls metaphysical realism. And that's an attempt on his part to characterize a realist view about truth and reality. As we'll see, some realists will want to object to how he characterizes their view, because by setting it up the way he does, he sets it up for certain kinds of criticism, which they think it avoids. But in connection with metaphysical realism, Putnam takes it that the metaphysical realist holds that truth is non-epistemic, in fact, radically non-epistemic. He thinks that the metaphysical realist is committed to the possibility of adopting a God's eye point of view. Thinks you can't. And he also thinks that the metaphysical realist is committed to the possibility that an absolutely perfect ideal theory, the ideal theory that science would get to at the end of inquiry, it could still be false. That's how he characterizes metaphysical realism. He objects to a couple of those things I just mentioned, and then he proposes instead an internalist conception of realism, an internal realist position. And the characteristic feature of that view is that truth isn't correspondence. It's not non-epistemic. Truth, for the internal realist, is idealized rational acceptability or idealized justification. So truth actually is an epistemic notion for the internal realist. Just a word on Hilary Putnam. This is a major philosopher, almost of the standing of someone like Quine. In the late 19th, he's still with us, though his output is decreasing as he must be in his 90s or something. So in the late 70s and early 80s, I would guess for around a 10-year period, Putnam defended the position that is called internal realism. Main sources for this are a couple of his books, Meaning the Moral Sciences and Reason, Truth, and History, plus papers in his third collection of philosophical papers called Realism and Reason. I've got you reading Chapter 3 in the Reader, Chapter 3 of Reason, Truth, and History. Putnam is one of these philosophical figures who didn't adopt and maintain a view consistently throughout his career. And he took this, in a sense, to be a matter of intellectual honesty. He just kept changing his mind. I mean, there's philosophers who will defend the same view right through their career. Putnam pretty much invented important positions and then dropped them, or espoused positions which he defended and then after a while dropped them. So he was initially, and this is a word he only would use later, he was initially a metaphysical realist or an externalist. He dropped that. In fact, he was very influential in getting people to adopt various realist views. He then dropped that position and became an internal realist, which he maintained for roughly 10 or so years, maybe a bit longer. Then he sort of swung back the other way and became, for a while, what he called a direct realist. And then the last point in his trajectory that I can keep track of, he seemed to be pretty much a pragmatist. Certainly wrote books called with titles like Pragmatism, and so pragmatism in the title. So we're going to be looking at a view that he endorsed for a period of time, and he later dropped it. But I'm choosing it because it fits well with the issues of the relationship between truth and justification in an epistemological context, and it helps us get the issue of realism going. Now, as I've said, the feature or the characteristic that sets internal realism apart is that it adopts an epistemic conception of truth. It takes truth to be related to justification. It's a kind of justification. The way Putnam gets his case for internal realism going is to start by characterizing the position that he would effectively think most realists endorse, which he calls metaphysical realism. And then he seeks to undermine metaphysical realism as part of setting up the case he's going to then make for internal realism. So I'm going to start by the way in which Putnam characterizes the metaphysical realist stance. And then once we've done that, we'll see how that leads into internal realism. But the first thing I want to do is just go back over a point I've already mentioned to try to secure the relevance of this issue to our concerns with respect to knowledge. So I mentioned last time that if we're working with a broadly justified true belief conception of knowledge, then you need to think about the relationship between truth and justification. If truth and justification are distinct, then you've got a distinction between justified belief and knowledge. If they're not distinct, then you run the two things together. Now, if you work with a notion of truth that is non-epistemic, right, that doesn't connect truth up with justification, so for example a correspondence conception of truth, then you've got no trouble distinguishing between justified belief and knowledge, right? If truth is non-epistemic, then justification and truth are distinct. So you can distinguish knowledge and justified belief. On the other hand, if you think that truth is an epistemic property, say for example coherence, then you're going to have a harder time keeping justification and knowledge distinct. You're going to have a harder time keeping justification and truth distinct. And so you're going to have knowledge and justification collapsing into each other, right? If you adopt an epistemic conception of truth, it's at least a question whether you're going to be able to distinguish between truth and justification, and it's at least a question whether you're going to be able to distinguish knowledge from justified belief, right? Non-epistemic conception of truth, the two things are quite distinct. Epistemic conception, you've got truth being very closely conceptually related to justification, so the distinction is going to be hard to maintain. This isn't actually going to be a problem for the position that Putnam argues for. That's one of the distinctive features of his conception of truth. So he takes truth, this is the internal realist speaking, the internal realist conception of truth he's defending. He takes truth to be ideal or idealized justification. The idea is that a true belief is not just a belief that's justified, right? So it's not a belief that happens to be justified by the ordinary standards that we have. It's rather a belief that is ideally justified. So you have to sort of idealize the notion of justification and think that if we continued to develop our sciences and develop our inquiry and epistemology and so forth, and we developed very sophisticated conceptions of methods and so forth for verifying claims, And when we could justify beliefs in an ideal way, in the best way possible, well, such ideal justification would be truth. Now, if you do it this way, then you do have a distinction between truth and justification, because truth is ideal justification, and justification is mere, ordinary, everyday justification. We have our beliefs now, which are supported by the evidence, and they will be justified. But they are not, or they may not be, ideally justified. And so he can distinguish truth from justified belief, and that's going to mean that in the context of JTB conceptions of knowledge, justification, justified belief, and knowledge are going to be distinct, because for Putnam, truth and justification are not exactly the same thing. Okay, so now I want to talk about what he means by metaphysical realism. This is the position that he's going to be criticizing, right? This is a position he's leaving behind. Perhaps he's describing a view that he formerly held. It's a position he thinks that realists endorse. It's a position he thinks needs to be given up. And at this point in his development, he thinks it needs to be given up in favor of the internalist position. What is metaphysical realism? So it's the idea that the world or reality is independent of our thought, independent of the way we think the world to be. He thinks that the world, right, this world that's independent of our thought, has a determinate set of objects, and these objects exist independently of human thought and language, right? They exist and they are the way they are independently of us, whether or not we think about them. Their existence is not something that depends upon our thought and our language. We speak in our language using words which refer to these things, right? We talk about these independent objects. So in our language we have referring expressions, and these referring expressions are names of, refer to these objects that exist independently of us. And this picture of there being a mind-independent world with determinate objects in it, and our language as containing words which we use to refer to those objects, is going to lead to a certain way of thinking about truth. So there's a metaphysical realist conception of truth, which is roughly correspondence. This idea that there's a world that exists independently of us, that fits nicely with the idea that truth is a correspondence between what we say and the way the world is. That truth is a correspondence relationship. So if, for example, we are talking about some object, an object existing independently of us, and we say of the object that it has some property, right, then if that object has that property, then what we say corresponds to the way the world is, and so what we say is true, right? So if I say this chair is orange, I've said something, and if the chair actually is orange, then what I've said corresponds to the way the world is, and so it's true. Now, truth in this correspondence sense doesn't depend upon my thinking that the chair is orange. Right? The truth of the claim depends on what color the chair is, on how the chair is. So truth does not depend on my thought about that, right? The truth of the claim the chair is orange depends upon how the thing is, how the chair is, not on what I think about it. Nor does it matter whether I have a lot of justification for the belief, right? We're looking at it, looks orange to me. That gives me justified belief that the chair is orange, but the truth of the claim that the chair is orange does not depend upon the justification of the claim. Truth is not the same thing as justification, it's independent. Right? So truth in this metaphysical realist correspondence conception of truth has to do with the way this entity is independently of us, whether or not we think it has any particular properties. So here's Putnam characterizing this view. According to metaphysical realism, there has to be a determinate relation of reference Right? So my word orange is picking out the color orange, and my word chair is picking out this object. Right? There's a determinate relationship of reference between terms in L and pieces or sets of pieces of the world. Right? That's a piece of the world over there that I just talked about using my words. Right? The world is supposed to be independent of any particular representation we have of it. Indeed, it's held that we might be unable to represent the world correctly at all. For example, we might all be brains in the vat. Right? He thinks the metaphysical realist is committed to the possibility that we might be brains in the vat. And if we're brains in the vat, then we're misrepresenting the world because we don't think we're brains in the vat. Right? The most important consequence of metaphysical realism is that truth is supposed to be radically non-epistemic. Right, so what he's saying is the most important consequence of the metaphysical realist view is that truth is radically non-epistemic. It radically doesn't depend on what we think or believe or our justification. And that's going to contrast with internal realism. He's going to define truth as being an epistemic notion. So the contrast between internalism and metaphysical realism is to do with the question of whether truth is epistemic or not. So one way of bringing out the consequences, or the consequence of metaphysical realist notion of truth, is to think about the ideal theory. For the realist, the idea that truth is radically non-epistemic means that we don't have, when we define the notion of truth, that notion is not defined in epistemic terms. The notion of truth is not defined in terms of words like coherence or justification. Now, if you then consider the ideal theory, and what's the ideal theory? Well, just assume that we continue all of our inquiry systematically, and we gather all possible evidence, and all of our views are massively tested as far as they possibly can be. There's no further evidence that can come in. We're at the end of all possible scientific inquiry. We have all possible evidence. All of our theories satisfies all the criteria we can think of. That'll be ideal science, or the ideal theory will be what we accept at that ideal end point, right? There could be some theory, some great big massive theory that is maximally supported by all the evidence. It's epistemically ideal, but is that theory true? Well, the realist is not going to say that that theory has to be true. Let T1 be an ideal theory by our lights, lifting restriction on our actual all too finite power. We can imagine T1 to have every property except objective truth. Right? We're not going to define this theory as being true. It's got all these properties, but we're going to leave truth out of it. For example, T1 can be imagined to be complete. Right? So it's a theory that covers everything. It's consistent. There's no internal inconsistency. To predict correctly all observation sentences. Right? It gets every empirical claim right. To meet whatever operational constraints there are. If these are fuzzy, let them be clearly met. It's going to be beautiful, simple, plausible, etc. The supposition under consideration is that T1 might be all this and still in reality be false. The ideal theory, the way that Putnam is thinking of it, couldn't possibly be improved. It satisfies all epistemic criteria. It's simple, fits all the facts, and so forth. But we haven't defined truth in epistemic terms. Truth is not an epistemic notion. Right? So, if a theory satisfies all the epistemic criteria maximally, the ideal theory, that doesn't entail that it's true. Because truth is a non-epistemic notion for the metaphysical realist. Truth isn't defined in terms of satisfying epistemic criteria. So there's a gap for the metaphysical realist between the ideal theory and truth. The ideal theory might be true, but equally it could be false. So the fact that the theory is ideal doesn't entail that it's true. Might be true, The fact that it's ideal doesn't mean that it's true. So, for the metaphysical realist, this is a position that Putnam's opposing. The ideal theory can in fact be false. Right? And this is the implication of saying that truth is radically non-epistemic. So in this conception, this metaphysical realist conception, truth, correspondence truth, depends on or is a relationship between language and the world. He capitalizes the notion the world, that thing, the world, all the objects, including us that exist, it exists independently of what we say or what we think about the world. We talk about objects in the world. Our words refer to objects in the world. And when we say things are a certain way and they are a certain way, then what we say is true. So truth is a relationship between what we say in our language and the way the objects and the properties that they possess are independently of us. So truth comes out as being a non-epistemic notion, right? Here's a question that Putnam raises about this metaphysical realist scenario. Right? We live in this mind-independent, objective world with these objects that exist independently of us, and our claims about these objects being true or false depending on how the world is. This picture that we've got, Putnam wants to know where the human agent, the epistemic subject, is in this scenario. Where is the human? When we describe the metaphysical realist position, when we say that there's this mind-independent reality that exists independently of us and our claims are made true or false by a correspondence to the way the world is, where are we in that picture? We're the ones who are describing this position. We're describing ourselves as inhabiting the world, as being surrounded by mind-independent objects. We're describing the notion of truth. But Putnam thinks that in order to describe this position, this scenario, this situation that we're in, we, in describing it, have to be able, or at least to pretend to be able, to occupy a certain kind of perspective. In order to describe the position of metaphysical realism, in order to describe this relationship with the human who has true beliefs about this external world, in order to describe that, we have to step out of ourselves in some sense. We need to be able to adopt an external perspective, an external vantage point outside of our own perspective in order to describe this position. So here's what he says. On this perspective, and right, he's describing the perspective of metaphysical realism, the world consists of some fixed totality of mind-independent objects. There is exactly one true and complete description of the way the world is. Truth involves some sort of correspondence relation between words or thought signs and external things and sets of things. He says, I shall call this perspective the externalist perspective because its favorite point of view is a God's eye point of view. So the thought is that the position that he's characterized and attributed to metaphysical realism presupposes that we can adopt a certain kind of external perspective. That we can, in order to tell this story, we have to be capable of stepping outside of ourselves in a certain sense and viewing our relationship to the world from an external viewpoint, from the viewpoint that he thinks of as being the God's eye point of view. So in order to articulate the metaphysical realist position, we need to, in a sense, occupy a position of God, or a God's eye point of view, and from that position, look at us and describe our position. Right? So his thought is that metaphysical realism requires a God's eye point of view. We'll come back to that. He thinks this is not something that can be done, right? Now, Putnam also says in his description of what the realist is committed to, that in this mind-independent world that has this fixed totality of objects, that there is exactly one true and complete description of the way the world is. Right? So here's the picture. There's a world that exists independently of us. There are all these independently existing objects. There's a determinate number, a fixed number of these things that exist independently of us. We describe the world and what we say is true or false about it because of correspondence relationships with the world. And he takes this to suggest that there is exactly one true and complete description of the way the world is. Right? This seems, you might think of this as being fairly intuitive. There's just the way the world is independently of us. There's only one way it is. And so there's just going to be one true description of it, one absolutely complete, full characterization of the way the world is. He seems to think that this idea that there is exactly one true and complete description of the way the world is comes out of the idea that truth is correspondence and the idea that there's a fixed totality of mind-independent objects. So, metaphysical realist view that he's described is that there is a fixed totality of mind-independent objects. Truth is correspondence between what we say and those objects. There's one true, complete description of the way the world is. Truth is radically non-epistemic. The ideal theory that we get to at the end of inquiry might be false. And in order to articulate this scenario, the realist has to be able to adopt a God's eye point of view. Right? So here's the metaphysical realist position that Putnam is setting up for attack. He's going to criticize. So I've been trying to get across his realist position, or the realist position he's stalking. Now I want to look at the way in which he criticizes the realist position. First, he thinks it's not possible to adopt a God's eye point of view. He thinks that realism, metaphysical realism, is committed to the possibility of radical skepticism, and he thinks that's a mistake. Radical skepticism really shouldn't be, in a sense, permitted, shouldn't be allowed. And he rejects the idea that the ideal theory might be false. He thinks the ideal theory is true. So, in order to express, in order to formulate, in order to articulate the metaphysical realist scenario, Putnam thinks we would have to be able to step out of our heads. We'd have to be able to adopt a God's eye perspective. We'd have to speak from not our perspective, but some external vantage point in order to describe the realist view. But he doesn't think that that makes any sense. Right? There's no way in which we can remove ourselves from our perspective. We're always in our perspective. We're always within our perspective. We cannot, even for the purposes of describing a position, pretend that we can adopt a God's eye point of view. He says there is no God's eye point of view that we can know or usefully imagine. There are only the various points of view. Well, perhaps there's one that God's got, right? But we can't know it. We can't adopt it. We can't usefully imagine it for ourselves. There are only the various points of view of actual persons, reflecting various interests and purposes that descriptions and theories subserve. So he thinks no God's eye point of view. If metaphysical realism is committed to the possibility of adopting a God's eye point of view, then that's a problem for metaphysical realism. We're inextricably bound up with our human perspective on the world. We cannot occupy this external standpoint, and given that metaphysical realism requires that we be able to adopt this standpoint for at least the purpose of expressing the position, metaphysical realism is undermined. We can't even adopt the position that's required to formulate the metaphysical realist position. To formulate and present metaphysical realism, we have to adopt the God's eye point of view. We can't do that, so the position, in a sense, can't even be intelligibly articulated. There's something that has to be done as a precondition of expressing the view, and that precondition, that thing, we can't do. We can't do it. So that's the first point. He rejects the idea that we can adopt a God's eye point of view. He rejects the idea that we can intelligibly defend the position that's committed to the possibility of God's eye point of view. Another problem that he sees. This is actually of relevance to the issues we've discussed earlier in this class about skepticism. And in a sense, it's a response to skepticism that comes from a direction we haven't explored. He thinks that it's the stance of metaphysical realism, right? And that's the stance that involves correspondence truth, truth being radically non-epistemic, mind-independent world existing independently of us, our views being true about it. He thinks that stance actually encourages skepticism. It encourages extreme skepticism, such as the Cartesian evil demon or the brain in the vat scenario. And he thinks these scenarios aren't actually genuinely possible. These radical, skeptical scenarios aren't actually possible. And the fact that metaphysical realism, in a sense, enables them is a problem for metaphysical realism, because these aren't actually genuine scenarios. They're not genuine possibilities. I'm going to talk now about how he deals with external world skepticism of the brain in the vat variety. He'd really be the one who put this way of thinking about Cartesian skepticism on the map. So this is from Recent Truth in History. This is him talking about the possibility that you are brains in vats, that we all are. And I think I gave this on the first day of class as an indication of one kind of topic that people doing epistemology sometimes concern themselves with. So imagine that a human being, you can imagine this to be yourself, has been subjected to an operation by an evil scientist. The person's brain, your brain, has been removed from the body and placed in a vat of nutrients which keeps the brain alive. The nerve endings have been connected to a super scientific computer which causes the person whose brain it is to have the illusion that everything is perfectly normal. There seem to be people, objects, the sky, etc. But really all the person, you, is experiencing is the result of electronic impulses traveling from the computer to the nerve endings. The computer is so clever that if the person tries to raise his hand, you can think of more, the feedback from the computer will cause him to see and feel the hand being raised. Okay, so here's brain in the vat scenario. Putnam thinks that metaphysical realism is committed to the intelligibility and the possibility that we might be brains in the vat. Now he thinks that this is actually one of the things that's wrong with metaphysical realism. And he has an argument to show that in fact we couldn't possibly be brains in the vat. I don't know what you'll think of it. I always think at the end of it, well gee, if I have a brain in the vat, I'm still going to be worried even if what he says is true. But his basic thought is that as brains in the vat, the kind of connection that's required to obtain between our words and the world don't obtain. So our word brain and our word vat and our word nutrient fluid don't actually refer, if we're brains in a vat, don't actually refer to brains and vats and nutrient fluid, right? The relation of reference between our words and the world doesn't obtain if we're brains in the vat. And as a result of that, we can't say truly that we're brains in the vat. So here's the way he puts it. The vat, quote marks, the word vat refers to vats in the image and vat English or something related, but certainly not to real vats. Since the use of vat in vat English has no causal connection to real vats, part of the hypothesis that we're brains in a vat is that we aren't brains in a vat in the image. I.e., what we're hallucinating isn't that we're brains in a vat. So if we're brains in a vat, then the sentence, we're brains in a vat, says something false, if it says anything. In short, if we're brains in a vat, then then the sentence, we're brains in a vat, is false. So it's necessarily false. Right? You should feel reassured by that. Brain in the vat could be entertaining the words, I'm a brain in the vat. But the word vat, as used by the brain in the vat, doesn't refer to a real vat. And the word brain, as used by that brain, doesn't refer to a real brain. So, because the words don't refer, the sentence, I'm a brain in a vat, can't be true. Right? So it can't be true that I'm a brain in a vat. So he thinks you can just rule out the brain in the vat scenario. And presumably, he would think there would be some sort of comparable move to be made with respect to Cartesian skepticism. And his thought is that metaphysical realism is what underlies external world skepticism and is what permits us to take external world skepticism seriously. And what he's going for, of course, is to reject metaphysical realism, so we're not going to be thinking about external world skepticism anymore. We're going to adopt what he's going to call an internalist conception, and in such internalist conceptions, extreme skeptical scenarios aren't going to be viable. Now, talk about truth for a minute. As a characteristic feature of the metaphysical realist view, we saw that truth is radically non-epistemic, right? And an implication for this is that the ideal theory at the end of science could actually be false, right? The theory that cannot be improved in any way, the epistemically ideal theory, that theory, according to the metaphysical realist, might be false. Putnam objects to this. He doesn't think that the ideal theory could be false. He doesn't think that's possible. He thinks the metaphysical realists are right when they distinguish between truth and justification. That's not what he's against. He thinks they're right to do this, but he doesn't think that distinguishing truth and justification requires us to treat truth as being radically non-epistemic. And you can distinguish truth from justification, but treat truth as an epistemic notion. So, take a claim like the earth is flat. That sentence might have been such that it was acceptable on rational grounds to believe it at some time. At some other time, for example, now, it's no longer acceptable for us to, no longer rationally acceptable for us to believe it. Can't be true at one time, not true at another, otherwise you'd have the earth changing shape, right? You don't want to say that it was true then and it's false now. And what the metaphysical realist does is say, okay, we distinguish between truth and justification, and we say it was justified once to believe that the earth is flat, but it wasn't true. It's justified now to reject the claim that the earth is flat, and it's true that the earth is not flat, right? So by distinguishing justification and truth, the realist is able to enable us to talk about this kind of thing here. But Putnam's thought is you don't actually have to make truth radically non-epistemic in order to do that. If you distinguish between mere, everyday, ordinary justification, justified belief, and idealized justification, you're able to do that. People once were justified in believing that the earth is flat. That was justified then, in a kind of ordinary, everyday way, but that wasn't maximally justified. At the ideal end of inquiry, it's going to be the claim that the Earth is not flat, assuming we're right, which is going to be in the ideal picture. That's going to be ideally justified. So we can distinguish between there being justified in believing the Earth is flat and it being true that the Earth is flat. Justified is one thing, truth is idealized justification. I hope that's clear. So let's think about the possibility that truth is idealized justification. We saw that for the metaphysical realist, the ideal theory might be false, but what if truth is idealized justification? Consider the ideal theory that's reached at the end of all inquiry. That theory is going to maximally satisfy all epistemic standards. It's got to be ideal. If truth is ideal justification, then the ideal theory is true. Right? The ideal theory is ideally justified, and truth for the internalist is ideal justification. So the ideal theory is going to be true. The ideal theory can't be false. Now, Putnam has a kind of a formal proof lying in the back of his head that he appeals to at this point. He's a bit quick about it, but the intuitive idea is that a theory which is consistent has to have a model. And a model in formal semantics and mathematical logic is where the symbols, the words, refer to things and are made true. Right? So a theory which has a model is one where there's a set of objects that make that theory true. And the proof, apparently, is that any consistent theory has to have a model. And his thought is that consistency is one of the epistemic criteria. And so the ideal theory, being ideal, is going to have to be consistent, so it must be true. And the reason he thinks it must be true, it can't be false, is because of this claim that any consistent theory has to have a model. He's a bit quick on that, but he's one of his reasons for thinking that the ideal theory can't be false is certain considerations in mathematical logic, formal semantics, and so forth. Okay. We've seen how he's resisting the metaphysical realist view, and now I want to spend the next few minutes describing the internalist position. The central point of the internal realist view is that truth is an epistemic notion. Truth is a kind of justification. A true belief is a belief that is justified in a certain kind of way. It's not ordinary, everyday justification. It's maximal, optimal, idealized justification. That enables us to distinguish between our beliefs being justified at a certain time and our beliefs being true. He wants to distinguish between truth and justification, but truth is going to wind up being an epistemic notion. So he says truth in an internalist view is some sort of idealized rational acceptability, some sort of ideal coherence, right? Here we have the notion of coherence, of our beliefs with each other and with our experiences as those experiences are themselves represented in our belief system, and not correspondence with mind-independent or discourse-independent states of affairs. So here we have the opposition. Truth for the internalist is some sort of idealized rational acceptability, some kind of ideal coherence. And it's not correspondence with mind-independent or discourse-independent states of affairs. That's stark contrast between the internalist view that he's endorsing and the externalist view that he's rejecting. There's a further kind of anti-realist aspect to this internalist view. Putnam says that Kant was, in his view, Putnam's view, the first internalist. And you can see this by thinking about the status of objects. So for the metaphysical realist, the external realist, there's a fixed totality of mind-independent objects. And the internalist rejects this idea that there are that objects are mind independent. The internalist you shouldn't think of the world as being constituted or consisting of objects and kinds of objects that exist somehow independently of human classificatory systems. For the internalist, it's a mistake to think that reality contains these objects that have somehow divided themselves up into distinct objects and distinct kinds of objects. It's not as if the world independently of us is divided up into objects and kinds of objects. For the internalist, the objects that exist and the kinds of objects that exist depend upon a set of concepts, a conceptual scheme, right? They depend upon a classification that some humans have developed using their concepts. So the world doesn't consist of a fixed totality of mind-independent objects. It's only once we introduce a conceptual scheme and start classifying things that the world starts to have objects and kinds in it. Right? So what kinds and objects there are depend upon conceptual scheme. So he says, signs do not intrinsically correspond to objects, independently of how these signs are employed and by whom. But a sign that is actually employed in a particular way by a particular community of users can correspond to particular objects within the conceptual scheme of those users. Objects do not exist independently of conceptual schemes. We cut up the world into objects when we introduce one or another scheme of description. Since the objects and the signs are alike internal to the scheme of description, it's possible to say what matches what. So the thought is that once humans have developed presumably a language, but in any event a set of concepts, and have begun to apply the set of concepts to the world, then you can start talking intelligibly about there being objects and kinds of objects, because this is somehow dependent upon the conceptual scheme that we have. So in that sense, the internal realist is not just rejecting the notion that truth is correspondence, but is also rejecting the idea that objects exist independently of us. There's a sense in which the objects do not exist independently of us. They depend upon the way in which we carve up the world using the concepts that we possess. Now, that's presentation of Putnam's characterization and criticism of metaphysical realism and his internalist stance. I'll be talking about this material for 2 more sessions. Tomorrow, I'll be looking at the ways in which realists respond and have responded to Putnam. One way is simply to reject the way he characterized metaphysical realism. It builds in some elements that realists may not want to buy into. For example, Putnam characterizes metaphysical realism in terms of the idea that there's one true, complete description of the world. A realist may not want to use that as a way of formulating their position. He characterizes the realist view in terms of the view that there's a fixed totality of mind-independent objects. Again, the realist may not feel that they need to adopt the view that there's a fixed totality of mind-independent objects in order to endorse their realist view. He thinks that realism requires a God's eye point of view. Maybe we don't need a God's eye point of view. Or maybe it's not such a bad thing, right? So the realist can object there as well. And the last thing I'm going to look at tomorrow is an argument that trades on the Tarskian T-scheme that I introduced before the break, to the effect that an epistemic conception of truth, like Putnam's internalist idealized justification conception of truth, is going to lead to idealism. That conception of truth is going to lead to idealism. And the person who argues that assumes that leading to idealism is like a refutation. Of course, if you don't think it's a refutation, if you're not unhappy with idealism, then we're going to need arguments against idealism. And so, not tomorrow, but the next time, I'll look at some of the arguments for realism. Okay, so that's for tomorrow. And, well, you know, you can leave or you can stay. I'm happy to take questions, even though it's 10 after 6. Nick and then Justin.
The idea of a God's eye perspective seems to come up in philosophy a lot, and it's not just limited to epistemology. I was wondering, as an analogy, could you draw a reference to, say, in ethics, and when Peter Singer talks about the escalator of reason, and how we can adopt an impartial God's eye perspective morality by realizing that we're just one individual in the universe, and that we don't matter any more significantly than anyone else, and by doing that we gain impartiality where we can construct an objective ethic. Can you draw some kind of analogy between his take on a God's eye perspective in ethics and answering it in terms? So
is Singer saying we can, or that we can't adopt it?
I'm saying we can, when we realize that
we can.
Many, and that the universe doesn't care about us.
So if that's right, it looks like he thinks we can adopt a God's eye point of view. If he means it in a way roughly like Putnam, well, Putnam's saying you can't do it. But what I don't know is whether the fact that that's a moral ethics context makes a difference. Because you might want to say that morality is more closely reflective of the way we are, and our wants and our desires and so forth, and our makeup. Whereas in this context, we're talking about true descriptions of an external world. I don't know whether that's going to make a difference.
You could draw an analogy, or you could draw off it and try and answer Putnam's objection.
Oh, right. Okay, you might, but I'm not. See how far you can get with it. I'd be concerned that it only works because, well, either Singer's radically rejecting Putnam and he's prepared for a serious God's eye perspective, or the topic's a little bit different and he's got it sort of internal to internal. Justin.
I wondered whether the argument against the brains in the vat scenario, basically that we can define it out of existence by saying this is what we mean when we use language, and therefore whatever we say we can't really truly mean that. I wondered if anybody has ever actually challenged the linguistic aspects of what Putnam's on about.
Okay, so what he's assuming is that you need a relationship between word and object, which is a causal relation. Yes. And he's assuming the causal theory of reference, I think. And there's been a large literature on the causal theory of reference. Some people adopt it and some people don't. The causal theory was proposed in opposition to the older description theory of reference. It's substantial discussion of causal theory of reference.
Right. Because it seems that if that falls down, then a lot of what he's saying falls down. Well,
it does, but there's a lot of motivating work favoring a causal theory of some kind, or some kind of causal condition. Other questions? Artem, and then Paul.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what does the notion of truth, what work does that do to Putnam? I mean, is he basically like putting an alternate label on?
So he thinks the metaphysical realist is right to distinguish between a belief being justified and it being, a justified belief that we think is true but turns out to be false, right? So we once believed that the earth was flat and we were justified in doing so, but it's turned out that we were wrong. And the metaphysical realist wants to be able to distinguish between that situation where we're justified, the belief is false, and the truth and falsity of the belief, right? But he agrees with the metaphysical realist about that. We need to be able to distinguish between a belief being justified and if it's false, not being knowledge. So that's why he wants this notion of truth to at least do that.
But it seems like when the metaphysical realist talks about truth, and they say, something's true, then they're trying to make kind of like a metaphysical claim. Whereas when Putnam is using truth, he's just referring to that ideal aspect of justification. So it seems like they're using truth in different senses. It seems like
Yeah, it could be. They're certainly going to be using it in different senses if the correspondence theorist defines truth as correspondence and he defines it as ideal justification. The sense will be different. I think both are going to hope that it complies with the T scheme, so it's going to be a formal feature of truth that they want to have in common. But part of what Putnam's doing is objecting to the realist thought that we can really genuinely be thinking about ourselves as having sentences or beliefs that correspond to this